Welcome to the One in the Many. My name is Arshak Ben-Lian. My purpose with the One in the Many podcast is to explore the process of integration as developmentally formative and therapeutically corrective factor in human psychology. The One in the Many is the study of how conscious life differentiates identity, integrates relation, regulates itself under constraint, and sustains direction through time. Subscribe to the One in the Many podcast and connect with me by writing to abenlian@oneinthemany.net. We never experience our lives in full dimension. The totality of who we are, our memory, values, biology, history, expectations, aspirations, skills, traumas, integrations, and contradictions exists as a vast manifold, far too rich to enter consciousness directly. Instead, we encounter life through a narrow, illuminated corridor, a single moment, a focused experience, a fleeting yet potent slice of awareness. What appears to us as simplicity is the surface of unfathomable complexity compressed into usable form. This compression is not arbitrary. It is the expression of a deeper principle: projection. Mathematical projection is the mapping of a higher dimensional structure onto a lower dimensional surface. A vector is projected onto a subspace. A manifold is projected onto a simpler domain. A function is projected onto a basis that clarifies its essential features. Something of identity is preserved. Something is inevitably lost. And the resulting form is both faithful and incomplete. Consciousness performs precisely this operation. At every instant, the mind projects the accumulated manifold of the self onto the plane of present awareness. The moment becomes a rendering, a slice, an interface between integration and action. The intensity of the moment is the magnitude of this projection. The density behind it is the richness of the integrated self. The past in this framework is not simply a chronological archive. It is a density of integrations, attained values, forged concepts, refined distinctions, and stored emotional meanings. The future is not merely a stretch of unmade time. It is a directional field, an orientation toward which one projects purpose, intention, and the arc of becoming. The present is the meeting point where these arcs intersect, where the full manifold of the self is compressed into immediate experience. When the density behind the projection is vast and coherent, the present feels charged with significance. When density is fractured or thin, the present feels empty or chaotic, unable to support the weight of purpose. This principle illuminates the entire architecture of the One in the Many. Differentiation isolates identity. Induction extracts causal understanding. Integration builds higher order unities. But projection is the lens through which all these operations re-enter lived experience. Projection is not the end of the cycle, but its renewal point. The phase where meaning is returned to perception and perception becomes the next material for meaning. It is the hinge of psychological motion, the point where the self touches the world with the fullness of its structure. The nervous system itself is built upon projection. The central nervous system constructs the manifold: perception, memory, inference, conceptual hierarchy. The autonomic nervous system supplies the physiological gradients through which experience becomes embodied: arousal, calm, heat, tension, metabolic readiness. The autonomic nervous system projects its state upward into consciousness as emotion, mood, urgency, hesitation, or clarity. Consciousness projects downward into the body in the form of volitional command, the focusing of attention, the modulating of breathing, the distribution of muscular tension, the redirection of metabolic energy toward valued tasks. The dialogue between the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system is reciprocal projection, each translating its domain into the other's language, each shaping the other's structure over time. Through repeated cycles of projection, even anatomy is altered. Neural pathways strengthen or weaken. Dendritic fields expand or retract. Metabolic pathways become more efficient or more fragile. The body becomes the record of the self's chosen projections, the musculature of habit, the posture of meaning, the neurochemical signature of one's values. Integration shapes form. Volition shapes integration. Projection is the mechanism that makes form permeable to choice. Every moment of awareness presses itself into the flesh, and the flesh returns the gradients to the mind as the emotional texture of lived experience. Projection also clarifies the metaphysics of identity across time. Identity is not a fixed entity, but a continuous manifold preserved through change. Like a complex geometric object that remains itself under rotation, deformation, or projection, the self maintains continuity by preserving invariance, its core values, its deepest commitments, its orientation to reality. What consciousness receives in any instant is not the full manifold, but the invariant projected into particular context. When one's hierarchy is stable, projection preserves coherence. When one's hierarchy is fragmented, projection becomes distorted. Disintegration, in this light, is a misprojection, an attempt to map a fractured manifold onto the present, resulting in distortion, emotional volatility, or cognitive collapse. The intensity of emotion becomes intelligible through this model. Emotion is the energetic magnitude of the projection of value density onto the circumstance at hand. When a highly integrated value is directly engaged, threatened, or advanced, the projection length is immense. The moment becomes saturated with energy, urgency, and significance. Emotion is not raw affect, it is value in motion, the felt expression of integration encountering reality. Conversely, when values are poorly integrated or contradictory, projection becomes weak or erratic, producing flatness, confusion, or oscillating states of reactivity. The emotional life of the individual becomes a measurable reflection of the geometry of the self. This structure deepens across the developmental stages. In childhood, the manifold is sparse and locally defined. Differentiation dominates. The world is learned through discrete units and immediate sensations. Projections are short because density is thin. Intensity arises from immediacy rather than integration. In adolescence, the manifold expands in all directions. Identity is under construction. Values are being selected, and the individual experiments with new orientations. Projections oscillate, sometimes long with newfound ideals, sometimes short and fragmented with uncertainty. In adulthood, density becomes stable. Integration deepens. Projections become longer, more coherent, more powerful. The individual begins to experience the present not as an isolated moment, but as a meaningful compression of a purposeful life. In mature adulthood, projection becomes architectural. The self's density is immense. The present feels serene because integration is so thorough that little energy is wasted in reorientation. The projection of identity onto action becomes efficient, elegant, and stable. The signature of wisdom. This developmental arc is mathematically precise. As the manifold expands, differentiation, strengthens integration, and gains coherence, value hierarchy, the projection into present awareness increases in magnitude and fidelity. The integrated individual lives with clarity because his present is the accurate rendering of well-constructed internal world. The disintegrated individual lives in confusion because his projection is the distorted mapping of an unstructured manifold. Projection also reveals the temporal architecture of volition. Consciousness does not choose in the abstract. It chooses in the projected moment. Volition is the act of aligning the projection with one's highest values, of orienting the manifold toward the goal line of a chosen future. The moment of choice is the point where projection becomes transformation. What is selected in the present becomes part of the manifold that will later be projected again, and through repeated cycles of volition, the self becomes sculpted by its own projections. This is why the present is the site of both freedom and responsibility. It is the projection point through which the future becomes shaped and the past becomes reinterpreted. Beyond psychology, Projection offers a philosophy of existence. Reality is not veiled or hidden. It is encountered through the projection of the self's conceptual and perceptual capacities onto the world. The world presents itself according to the structure of the mind capable of apprehending it. This does not mean the world depends on the mind. It means the mode of encounter is shaped by the architecture of integration. A richer self perceives a richer world. A fractured self perceives a world in fragments. Projection is the bridge between metaphysical identity and psychological experience, between what is and what is seen, between existence and consciousness. Ultimately, projection is the living process through which unity becomes multiplicity and multiplicity becomes unity. The manifold of past integrations and future orientations collapses into the singularity of the now, which then unfolds again into new differentiation and integration. It is the recurrent breathing of the self, the inhalation of accumulated meaning into presence, and the exhalation of present action into the expanding manifold of identity. Projection is the principle by which the one becomes the many in experience, and the many become one in the architecture of the self. Projection, as treated within the framework of the one in the many, bears little resemblance to what psychology has conventionally labeled projection. The same word covers two radically different phenomena. One, a structural necessity of consciousness, the other, a defensive distortion symptomatic of disintegration. The conflation of these two meanings is one of the reasons psychology has remained conceptually fragmented. The one in the many restores precision by differentiating projection as a mechanism of integration from projection as a mechanism of avoidance. In the conventional psychological sense, projection is defined as the misattribution of one's unacceptable thoughts, impulses, or feelings onto another person. It is a displacement of interior conflict onto an exterior object, a maneuver designed to relieve internal pressure by exporting it. In this usage, projection is fundamentally a form of psychological disavowal, an attempt to see in the world what one refuses to recognize in oneself. It is defensive, reactive, and rooted in the avoidance of self-awareness. Classical psychoanalysis saw it as a shield against anxiety. Contemporary cognitive psychology sees it as a bias or heuristic error. Modern clinical treatments identify it as a marker of emotional dysregulation or identity disturbance. In all its forms, the defining feature of conventional projection is its inaccuracy. The world is distorted because the self is unwilling or unable to integrate parts of its own content. In the one in the many, projection is of an entirely different order. It is not a distortion, but a structural transformation, the means by which the manifold of identity becomes usable in the field of awareness. Projection here is the functional compression of the integrated self, its values, memories, conceptual patterns, physiological tones into the clarity of a single moment. It is the operation by which depth becomes immediacy, density becomes intensity, and identity becomes action. Without projection, no integrated content could enter consciousness. Without it, the self would remain a silent interior architecture without expression. Conventional projection pushes unwanted content outward. The one in the many's projection brings the entire architecture of the self inward to the point of contact with reality. One is defensive, the other is volitional. One conceals, the other reveals. One disowns identity, the other makes identity operative. The contrast extends further. In conventional psychology, projection indicates a failure of differentiation, the inability to distinguish between one's internal states and external reality. It collapses the boundary between self and the world because the self cannot tolerate parts of itself. In the one in the many, projection occurs only after proper differentiation and integration have taken place. It is the culmination of the IIR cycle, the final phase in which the integrated manifold is rendered in a contextually appropriate form for perception and action. The one in the many treats projection not as a blurring of boundaries, but as an architectural breach, a calibrated interface between the inner and outer worlds. The conventional sense of projection is tied to emotional immaturity. It arises when the density of the self is fragmented or insufficiently integrated, when the manifold is unstable, contradictory, or burdened by unprocessed affect. What appears outwardly as projection is inwardly the collapse of the self's capacity for integration. The one in the many does not deny this phenomenon, but it classifies it differently, not as projection, but as misprojection, a failure in the mapping between identity and moment, a disintegration of the interface rather than a mode of normal functioning. What psychology calls projection is, within the one in the many, the result of a deeper structural failure, the inability to cycle through differentiation, induction, and integration in a healthy manner. When the self cannot integrate its own material, it does not project into awareness. It leaks it into the world in distorted form. This is not projection, but the breakdown of projection, where the manifold cannot be brought into clarity and therefore erupts into perception as misattributed threat, impulse, or judgment. Conventional projection is thus a simple symptom of failed integration rather than an instance of the integrative mechanism itself. The two uses of the term stand in mirror opposition. Conventional projection collapses internal complexity into crude external attribution, distorts the world to escape the self, and weakens identity by refusing ownership of psychic content. The one in the many's projection distills internal complexity into purposeful clarity, reveals the world through the structure of the integrated self, and strengthens identity by bringing its full density into action. One degrades the boundary between self and world, the other defines it. One hides, the other illuminates. One rejects meaning, the other makes meaning possible. By recovering the deeper structural sense of projection, the one in the many restores to psychology a principle that has long been implicit but unnamed. The mind cannot function without the ability to render its own integration into the immediacy of experience. The present is always a projection because consciousness is always an interface, never a totality. Conventional psychology saw projection as pathology because it encountered only its distorted form. The one in the many reveals the healthy, indispensable form hidden beneath that distortion. In this way, the one in the many does not merely redefine projection, it reclaims it. It shows that the self's contact with reality is always mediated by the projection of its integrated architecture, and that the accuracy, stability, and vitality of that projection determine the quality of life. When integration is strong, projection is faithful. When the individual lives in a world that is intelligible, meaningful, and responsive to purposeful action. When integration collapses, projection warps, and the world becomes a screen for what the self cannot bear to contain. Thus, the contrast is complete. Conventional projection is the avoidance of integration. The one in the many's projection is the expression of integration. One is retreat from the self, the other is the self in motion. Let me leave you with this. Thinking, inferring, and inducing are modes of self-projection. To think is to move the mind outward, toward the world, toward facts, toward the independent identity of things, while simultaneously drawing upon the total structure of one's existing integrations. Thinking is direct contact, the deliberate orientation of consciousness to reality as it is, mediated by the context one already holds. But thinking never operates only in what is given now. It always moves forward. Even the simplest act of attention involves a projection of the self toward possibility, toward what further meaning might be extracted, what question should follow, what consequence the fact implies, what action it may guide. Thinking is the forward extension of the integrated self into the field of existence, a motion that demands the stability of past integrations, yet seeks to transcend their present form. To infer is a different motion, though rooted in the same architecture. Inference requires that the mind turn inward and backward, retracing the structure of its own knowledge, traversing the local connections that anchor concepts and principles to their earlier contexts. Deduction is a kind of descent from the higher level unity of a principle to the substructures that support it. But this backward movement is never merely retrograde. It is undertaken for the sake of moving forward again. The thinker returns through the hierarchy, not out of nostalgia, but to gather the strength of clarity, to validate coherence, and to project a sound conclusion into the future. Inference is thus a recursive movement, backward for grounding, forward for truth. It is the internal projection of the self through its own architecture before re-entering the world with a clarified trajectory. To induce is to extend the mind into the unknown. Induction is not retrospective, but anticipatory. It activates consciousness with a temporally forward orientation, combining differentiated observations of the present with the density of past integrations to form a new unity. Induction is the creation of conceptual advance, the emergence of a deeper pattern, a newly understood cause, a principle abstracted from the richness of experience. It requires the courage to project the self beyond what is already established, to risk the possibility of error for the sake of discovering a larger truth. In this sense, induction is the mode of cognition closest to becoming. It is the mind in the act of enlarging its own architecture. Despite their differences, all three activities are forms of self-projection. They are expressions of the mind's necessity to bring its internal manifold into functional contact with reality. Thinking projects the self directly into the world. Inferring projects the self backward into the structure of its own integrations before returning forward with renewed precision. Inducing projects the self into a future not yet known, synthesizing past and present into a novel conceptual structure. Each motion extends identity across time. Each engages the density of the integrated self. Each reveals how cognition is always a trajectory, a movement from what has been integrated toward what is possible to know. The quality of these trajectories depends entirely on the health of integration. When integrations are sound, thinking, inferring, and inducing strengthen the self. They become motions of coherence, a consolidation of identity across time. Thinking sharpens orientation. Inference deepens grounding. Induction expands the manifold. These modes of cognition feed one another. Thinking differentiates new data for induction. Induction expands the framework required for inference. Inference stabilizes the structures through which thinking proceeds. The IIR cycle, induction, integration, reduction, is not a mechanical sequence, but a living spiral. And each of these activities is a projection along one arc of that spiral. But when integration is weak, when contradictions remain unresolved, when values are unanchored, when the conceptual hierarchy is damaged, each cognitive motion becomes a motion of disintegration. Thinking loses its fidelity to reality and collapses into rationalization or projection of internal conflicts outward. Inference becomes contaminated by emotional bias or conceptual brittleness. unable to trace the hierarchy back into stable ground. Induction becomes fantasy, conjecture detached from observation, or nihilistic skepticism incapable of generating conviction. Instead of projecting the self outward through coherence, the self collapses inward through fragmentation. Thus, the difference between an integrated and disintegrated mind is not found in whether it thinks, infers, or induces. Every mind performs these motions, but in the quality of the projection each motion entails. Integration produces projection of increasing fidelity, coherence, and potency. Disintegration produces misprojection, distorted mappings of the self onto the world and the world onto the self. To think, to infer, and to induce are therefore not merely cognitive acts. They are existential motions, ways in which the self reaches toward reality and toward its own future. Every act of cognition is step in the unfolding of identity. Every conclusion strengthens or weakens the foundation of the next. The trajectory of a life is shaped by the accuracy, stability, and courage of these projections. And the health of the mind is measured by how well it can integrate each motion into the unified architecture of the self. This is the one in the many. The principle of life is the process of integration from a single cell to an ideal human being. The story of life unfolds through integration, from a single percept to a library of knowledge. Through virtue, reason, honesty, independence, selfishness, productivity, you set your values, purpose, to achieve self-esteem and happiness. Through time and energy, from induction to integration to reduction, the smallest particle unifies matter, and the highest purpose unifies your life. You, the one in the many, matter. May you integrate your life with value-driven days.